So, England and Scotland have had a rocky history, to say the least. The best way I can describe it is a hate relationship. But the one time in their history where things were at their rockiest was when an English king created a comically sized trebuchet whose sole purpose was to hurl comically sized rocks at a Scottish castle. Which I guess was also made of rocks, ironically. Trebuchet be like, I used the stones to destroy the stones. And this weapon, after it was finally finished being built, was named the Warwolf. It is the largest trebuchet ever built, and it is, potentially, the world's first wonder weapon. Hi, my name is Escarjo, and because I'm British, I am contractually obligated to find this entire story incredibly funny. If you're Scottish, you may disagree. So first, let me just make this clear. To my knowledge, no one else has ever claimed that the Warwolf is the world's first wonder weapon. It is arbitrary praise that I have thrust upon it without any substantial backing evidence. It is just my theory. We will get into whether I'm right or not a little bit later. First, we have to go through the history of the Warwolf, which we'll do right after we go over the history of the castle they would be used against. Which we'll do right after we go over the history of the rock that the castle sits upon. Which we'll do after I tell you all to subscribe to the channel. Thankfully that part can be done very quickly, as all I'm gonna say is, if you think I've earned it by the end of the video, please do consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video, all of the stuff that helps us grow. My goal for the end of the year is to hopefully hit 1,000 subscribers. I know that might be a bit much given that we're still, you know, a very small channel. We've got, what, 3 videos on there at the minute? But I don't know, it might actually be possible. And if you want to help make that goal a reality, please do subscribe. Like I said though, before we get to the fun topic of big trebuchet, we have to history first. The Scottish castle, which would eventually be the Warwolf's victim, is the famous Stirling Castle. Located in the city of Stirling, the site in which the castle would be built is basically everything you could ask for in terms of strategic importance. The land here is part of what's known as the Stirling Still, which is a large outcropping of a quartz intrusion believed to be 350 million years old. Or in other words, big rocks sticking out of the ground, which is very old. Some sources also say that the outcropping of rocks was actually an ancient, now extinct volcano, which is significantly cooler, so I say we just believe them. The way in which the site makes defense so good is because it's elevated up almost like a ramp, with cliff faces on 3 sides, and the height difference between the land surrounding it being about 250 feet. So if you wanted to attack this position, you would either have to commit to a costly siege and starve the enemy out, thus forcing a surrender, or launch a frontal assault at the castle where you'll have the undivided attention of the entire garrison. Or you could just reduce the entire castle to rubble with big rocks, but we're getting ahead of ourselves, aren't we? And even outside of direct battle, the elevated height when compared to the surrounding land made it so the defenders could see for miles around. Okay, all well and good, but the funny thing about defensive positions is, it helps if you have something worthwhile to defend. Otherwise, you'll find yourself in a situation where, as the town of Bolachulish across the country is being burnt to the ground, you're just sitting there being useless. Relatable, but not a good thing. However, in this aspect as well, the eventual castle's location was also superb. It was crucial for guarding one of the lowest and best crossing points of the River Forth, and the ability to do so would make the movements of your enemy much more difficult. So, because of all this, someone in the 9th or 10th century, maybe even earlier, would decide to fortify the area. here. The exact date for when the first iteration of what would eventually be Stirling Castle was built is unfortunately not known, as the first account we have of it was in 1110, when King Alexander I of Scotland would dedicate a chapel to an already existing castle. Regardless of that, we have a castle now. Great. And for years and years after, it remained great. That was until the English.
Was ist?
The events that would eventually lead to the First War of Scottish Independence all began in 1286. Okay, so basically you have this guy, Alexander III. He is the current King of Scotland. Then he's not because of death. So his 4-year-old daughter, who is currently in Norway, is sent home to become queen. And you may be like, she's 4, she can't be queen. But I say, at least she isn't dead. She then promptly died after landing on Orkney Island. And that is how you get a succession crisis. Something that is very easy to take advantage of, especially if you're the English. Fearing a civil war, the Guardians of Scotland, badass, asked King Edward I of England to choose a successor to the throne. Now this in hindsight may seem like a really stupid idea, because King Edward really wanted to conquer Scotland, so this would, in hindsight, give him the perfect opportunity. But you know, he seems like a pretty chill guy. I'm sure he wouldn't do that. He absolutely did that. He supported a man named John, who would eventually become the next King of Scotland. This was in 1292, and King John would swear homage to King Edward, which basically meant John was like, I am loyal to you, Edward, forever and ever and ever. And from Edward's perspective, King John was nothing more than a puppet ruler. And this arrangement would last a shockingly long amount of time. 2 years. In 1294, things started to unravel. I found a few different sources saying various things on what happened next, but it was either John himself or nobles that opposed his rule would contact France. They did this in order to create an alliance with France where if either of them were attacked by the English, the other would come to the aid of the defender. And all of this alliance making was done completely in secret, so the English, for a time, didn't know it was happening, but when they figured it out, it turned out to be a very big blunder. Unfortunately for Scotland, it would give King Edward I the justification he desperately wanted to launch an invasion, which he did in 1296. And with the war finally begun, at long last we're able to return to Stirling Castle, though not the Warwolf, not yet. The first potential engagement at the castle wouldn't lead to anything, as when King Edward arrived, it was already completely abandoned. So he occupied it and set some men with the task of upgrading its fortifications. However, only 1 year later, the Battle of Stirling Bridge would take place. That's the one from the film with William Wallace the Man, the Scot, the legend. Now, despite this being a proper violent battle, it too did not test the castle's defences, with a vast majority of the garrison being killed in the carnage outside of the castle's walls. Only a few were able to return, but they were quickly starved out, meaning that Scotland controlled the castle once again, though they too would lose it after losing the Battle of Falkirk. But then the British would be besieged while they had limited supplies, and they would not be able to be relieved by their army, so they would eventually leave. So after all of that, we're basically at where we started. The year is 1303 and Scotland controls Stirling Castle. But that did not mean the war was going well. In fact, it was going pretty not well. Stirling Castle was literally the last castle that Scotland controlled. That's how not well it was going. All King Edward had to do was capture this one final castle, one final time, and that was it. His victory would be complete. The king, though, still had a problem. Stirling Castle was already very well defended for all the reasons mentioned earlier, but on top of that, the garrison showed no signs of wanting to surrender. They had a decent amount of supplies, and even though their numbers were small, they knew the knowledge that they were the last castle in Scotland, so their willpower to continue would have been quite high. That's not all though, because despite having a decent amount of trebuchets with him, it would take a large amount of time to fully dismantle the castle with them. And time was something of a recurring issue with King Edward during this entire ordeal. He was furious with how long this had already taken, and the fact that the Scottish were extending that length even further by refusing to surrender. And soon it would become very, very clear just how done with it all he was, because he decided to make a weapon that could dismantle this entire castle in only a few shots. Yes, a little over 10 minutes into the video, and we're finally here. The creation of the Warwolf. King Edward would order his chief engineer, James of St. George, to construct this enormous trebuchet, which he would set about doing. And this was, for the time, a massive undertaking. Reportedly, the project needed 5 master craftsmen and 49 labourers, 3 months to build the beast. Now, some of you may be hearing all those numbers and be a bit confused because they're not really very high, and in a way, you're right, they're not. But back in the 1300s, they were definitely more impressive. Spending 3 months and a significant amount of resources to build just one weapon is out of the ordinary to say the least, and about those resources as well, it reportedly took about 30 wagons to transport it all to the battlefield. So not even slightly comparable to the wars fought today, or even wars fought shortly after this one, but for the time, it was quite something. Next, I want to talk about the specifications surrounding the Warwolf, how big it was, and its power mainly. However, before that, I need to give a quick caveat. None of these are probably too accurate. We have no real documentation about this monster, so we don't know exactly how big, how strong, or how anything really it was. And the best example of why that is so comes from the Warwolf's apparent height. It was, if a fair few sources are to be believed, 90 to 150 meters tall. Now, for comparison, the best average size for your typical trebuchet used by the English at that time period, 20 meters tall. So yeah, if it is anywhere near accurate that this thing was 100 meters tall, we are massively underselling how hard it would have been to construct it. But even if we were to cut that height in half, we still have something that is double the size of an average trebuchet. In terms of power, it's claimed that the Warwolf could hurl boulders lit with Greek fire that weighed over 125 kilograms at objects over 200 meters away. Which doesn't seem like a lot. I mean, yeah, that's 2 American football fields in length, but it's also 2 Warwolves in length. I feel like it should be a lot further. Again, historical accuracy is to be debated, but the important thing is, it was powerful. It was the biggest weapon around at the time, and it was pointed directly at Stirling Castle. When this thing would be able to finally unleash a shot, it's quite possible that that shot would cause more damage than any other man-made weapon had ever in the history of humanity. On one side, we have a mighty fortress, situated in a perfect position for defense, and though throughout most of this war, it has yet to be truly tested, if its status as an impressive stronghold is to be believed, it potentially can weather any storm. And on the other side, we have the Warwolf, the largest siege weapon ever produced. A weapon so immense in power that even the mightiest stone walls would crack and fall within a matter of a few shots. This is a monster whose intimidating power alone should be considered an offensive tool. And disappointingly, it did that last part a little bit too well, because upon seeing it, the Scottish garrison surrendered immediately. They saw this Goliath lumbering beast heading towards them and decided not to take the chance. And while I do have to say, if the legends are true about this thing's size, that's a pretty smart call. However, very boring. In total, the Warwolf, the potential wonder weapon of its age, got to fire one stone at the castle, and this shot either just broke through the gate or sliced through two stone walls like a knife through cloth. Sources do vary. At least though, to be fair, while this ending may seem disappointing, the story of that one shot fired is pretty funny. There are two tales on how this played out, and from what I can tell, there's the English narrative, which makes them more badass, and the Scottish narrative, which makes them more stupid. The first is that Edward had received the message that the garrison wanted to surrender. However, because he was still really annoyed with how long this all took and just the undisciplined nature of the Scottish for defying the king, that he responded with LMAO and proceeded to ignore the request, after which he fired that one single shot at the castle, then accepted the surrender afterwards. The other story, which is unfortunately more likely true, which is sad because it's a lot less funny, is that King Edward basically got the message that the Scottish wanted to surrender, and then basically made a deal with them where some of them would be allowed to leave and some others would have to go back to the castle so he could fire a stone at them. Meaning, yes, there is potential that the Warwolf, the 100-meter tall monster trebuchet's only actual battle involved it being in a theatre play. It's one defining moment in war, basically accomplishing nothing but making the king smile a little bit. But you know, history is quite inaccurate, so it's very possible that it could have been the much more funny first story. And yeah, I just think that one is, you know, it's more realistic to the history of the English. I'm English, I know this stuff, don't fact check any of it. And by the way, I really do mean it when I say that was it. Shortly after the castle was captured, the Warwolf would disappear, never to be seen again. Either it was torn down for supplies, or perhaps destroyed in some other way. Possibly it could have just been destroyed by the Scottish after they were able to reclaim the castle a few years later, but we have no documentation on if that's true or not. The strangest thing of all though is the fact that even as many more battles would come where castles would play an instrumental role, nothing like the Warwolf would ever really be built again. Even at the legendary Stirling Castle, many more battles would take place there in an era where trebuchets were still effective. Once things like cannons entered the battlefield, the trebuchets' days were over, so we would never again get a chance for a Warwolf to enter the fray. The only other time something like that would be built would be as a replica, which, if I'm not mistaken, England still holds the record for the biggest one ever built. And honestly, I think that is all just such a terrible shame, because I love trebuchets. I don't know why, but whenever I played Rome Total War or Medieval Total War, I always loved being able to unlock them. It doesn't make sense, but it activates the monkey part of my brain that is like, yes, throw big rocket enemy, very cool, much damage. But okay, my stupid disappointment aside, we are at the end of the Warwolf's story. So let's go back to that arbitrary phrase I had thrust upon it at the beginning. Is the Warwolf the world's first wonder weapon? And the answer to that is, well, technically, Yes, it was a weapon that, for the time, was at the cutting edge of technology. It was intimidating and had immense destructive power behind it. It was something that, on paper, could alter any battlefield or potentially any war. I mean, if you have something that can destroy a castle, which is what people use to protect themselves, then you're going to alter the landscape itself of combat. But it's also something that cost an immense amount to build for the time, and it's a weapon whose practical purposes were only ever hypothetical. And worse, it's a weapon where you could make very legitimate arguments that it would be completely useless in a war, and may even hinder the side that was building it. So you may be hearing all that and be a bit confused, because when you hear Wonder Weapon, you think of something with such an immense power that it cannot be stopped, it cannot be countered. It is destruction perfected. To have the title of a Wonder Weapon, you are on top, you have no downsides. Well, let me show you a brief example of what I believe is the only true, actual wonder weapon to have ever been made by man. Pretty much every single weapon which is claimed to be a wonder weapon either had some massive defect which made them absolutely useless, never made it into production to begin with, or were made in such few numbers due to the high cost of them that they never were able to achieve anything. Now, to be fair, I am being a bit of a stickler here. I will admit there are some things you could absolutely argue are successful wonder weapons. Things like long-range missiles, radar, the gun, and like hundreds upon hundreds of other things. To break it down really simple, I think we have three different tiers. We have the Wunderwaffen, which we'll get to in a minute, but basically means failed wonder weapon, in my opinion. Then we have the game changer wonder weapon. This is something which will, in fact, change the way that wars are fought, but won't be able to win one all by themselves. And then we have the true wonder weapon, something that can win a war all by itself, and again, the only one that comes to mind which can do that is...
Полевой столб, поднимающийся с земли, быстро увеличился в объеме.
Let's look into the Wunderwaffens, and to keep things simple, we'll just bully one for the moment. The Panzerkampfwagen V3 Maus. Yes, we are now looking at World War II weapons. This video is a mess. The Maus really could be considered the Warwolf of the Second World War. The origins of this tank date back to 1942, a period in which Germany was still in a powerful position in the war, but one where some generals may have seen the danger of the Allies fastly approaching. Command at some point decided the army needed a tank, a super tank if you will, a tank so powerful it could clear a path through any line of defense and weather any offense. And they came up with this, a design which, on paper, sounds unstoppable, and in a video game, it would be the best thing around by far. It was a super heavy tank, plain and simple, weighing 180 tons. Making it the heaviest tank which was ever built, and for perspective, the Challenger 2, one of the heaviest tanks in service today, weighs only 64 tons. The Maus was designed with only two things in mind, power and armor. It had a 12.8cm Pak-44 as a turret, and 200mm of armor. You can really easily see the philosophy behind this thing. It's gonna have shells bounce off it left, right and center, and it's gonna destroy any other tank, or even an entire army of tanks it comes across. This is our Wunderwaffen, the Nazis said in perfect German. It will change the course of the war. It will be unstoppable. It did not, and it never would have been. Mainly because only 5 were ordered, 2 were built, and only 1 had a turret on it before the training grounds were captured by the Soviets. So already we've completed one of the categories for failed Wunderwaffen. It was built in far few numbers, and even a big tank like this, if it worked perfectly, is not gonna stack up to But okay, that's not really fair if you want to look at it in a hypothetical way in which, say, they were built in massive numbers, you know, hundreds, maybe even thousands of them. Could they make a difference then? No. Basically, any historian that's trying to determine how effective the mouse would have been in combat has come to one of the same conclusions. It's big, slow, and very obvious, so it would have just been torn to pieces by planes or artillery. Smaller allied tanks would have been able to run rings around it, and eventually they would either disable it and force the crew to evacuate, or just outright destroy it. It's so big it would barely be able to use normal roads and would have just got stuck everywhere. And finally, the most devastating one, the amount of resources needed would have probably bankrupted Germany. Okay, so briefly, if we look at another tank, the Tiger for example, now this was a fine tank all things considered. It wasn't an unstoppable monster, but it also wasn't complete garbage. But what it did need was a lot to get built. And as the war went on, Germany started running low on money and the exotic resources it needed to build its tanks. And this would lead to things like the Tiger and later King Tiger taking way more than they would ever dish out. Now if you will kindly just play pretend with me for a minute, let's amp that up to 11, say with a 180-ton metal monstrosity. Okay, no, big tank kind of failed, would have been a disaster if built in production. How does this loop around to our noble Warwolf? Well, like I said earlier, the mouse is really a reflection on the Warwolf, though in hindsight, I really should have used the Gustav Max, the big artillery gun, as a better example. That one's on me, but I'm lazy, so we're not going to re-record it. To be fair though, I could never diss the Gustav Max. I love that gun. That gun is actually just beautiful in every way, shape and form, and anyone that disagrees, leave. I do believe that the Warwolf is the world's first Wunderwaffen, because even though it was successful in the one battle it participated in, being able to intimidate the Scottish to surrender without a fight, which is the best kind of outcome for a battle. But if we take into account the fact that never again would one be built, and the one that was never used again, and if we look at a potential broader picture, say if they were used more in the war, I don't think it looks too good for the Warwolf. Remember, this is back in medieval times when tearing down an entire forest and hiring 30 or so skilled men to build it would be a large expense. And that is just for one weapon, and more specifically, one weapon that is very, very specialized. It's designed for destroying castles, and that is about it. So, okay, what happens if the war becomes more of a guerrilla war, which a lot of wars with Scotland would end up becoming? What is a big old catapult thing gonna do then? In addition, where are you going to store your 100-meter tall trebuchets where they won't be destroyed by sabotage? What happens if you're besieging a castle and another army comes in to relieve them? You've now just wasted 3 or so months building a weapon that is no longer going to be very useful. And if you lose that battle, there's no way you're going to be able to retreat with it, so you've just given your enemy a potentially very valuable tool. We can also look at the ability to transport it. Now, with the Warwolf itself, it was built on the battlefield, but it still needed to have its components sent there, and that was a big expense. Remember, it took like 30 wagons to do this. If you want to build a lot of these things, what's the constraint going to be on your supply lines? Is it going to seriously affect them, or can you still manage? What can the enemy do to counter it, and how easy would that be? This one is kind of hard to determine because we don't really know how powerful the Warwolf's one shot was. Again, some sources said it sliced through walls like they were butter, and others said it did basically no damage. Honestly, thinking about it now, if the latter were true, that would explain why one was never built again, and it absolutely should be considered a failed Wunderwaffen then. Well, if we do say, for the sake of argument, it could rip a castle's walls to pieces with only a few shots, it actually could go into the category of game-changer Wunderweapon, because at that point, castles would not really be very useful if they could just be destroyed with ease. The game of war would be altered completely. Makes sense. I mean, when's the last time we've seen an army hold out in a castle? We have ways to just wipe them off the planet now. If that was achieved a lot earlier, we would see the same effect, surely. So okay, two possible scenarios. It couldn't actually do too much damage to a castle, and therefore it is a failed Wunderwaffen like all the German ones. Or it could, and it is a game-changer wonder weapon, like, you know, radar, long-range missiles, stuff like that. But it'd still be far removed from a true wonder weapon. But to be fair, that's a pretty high bar to set. I mentioned earlier that I think it falls under the category of a failed Wunderwaffen. I don't think it had the power to do as much damage to a castle as some of the legends say. And because of that, all of the other things I mentioned earlier suddenly are a lot more problematic because you're not getting as big of a reward. Plus, and I know I'm being repetitive now, but it was never used again, so I think that's kind of like a good indication of how useful it truly was. Like, you need to understand, this was the first war of Scottish independence. There was another one. Yeah, you know, I'm gonna call it. Might be a game-changer wonder weapon. I think it's a Wunderwaffen. If you disagree, leave a very long comment, and if it's good enough and makes enough points, I'll make a part 2 to this, in which I will admit I'm wrong and be like, yes, this person right here, smarter than me. Not a hard thing to do, so if you think you can achieve that, go for it, and I promise you, I will upend my end of the bargain. I will fully admit to being wrong if you can prove it. I'm potentially very, very dumb, but I ain't a goddamn coward. Okay, mental ramblings aside, where does that leave this disgrace of a video with 3 different elements, all tangentially related to big rock-throwing wooden thing made in the 1300s? I don't know! And like I said, I just like trebuchets, and I wanted to talk about the Warwolf, so I decided, hey, this could be the world's first wonder weapon. Let's tie it all together with that, because why not? And you know what? That's all I need. The Warwolf is cool, and I wanted to make a video talking about it, and I have accomplished that task. And hey, we got to learn about the history of Stirling Castle, the mouse tank, different types of wonder weapons. Yo, it's a complete package. It's quite good, I think, maybe. Please agree. Listen, if you enjoyed this, just subscribe, and please go and watch some of my other videos that are far better and more put together. Like, go and watch my Man-Eating Animals Iceberg. That's like a genuinely entertaining video. Or should I say 2 videos, because there were so many goddamn animals on that iceberg that I had to spend a lot of time researching and just ended up talking so much about so many of them. Like, I guarantee you, if you go and watch those 2 videos, you will not recognize about 80% of the killer animals I have mentioned on there, and I still think there are some that I forgot to do. In fact, there's actually one specific case of multiple man-eating animals that I never included. Someone's walking down the stairs, I don't know if you can hear that. But you know, maybe that's because I was saving it for another video. Maybe one will be coming out in the next few weeks. Who knows? It's wacky. Who knows? Anyway, yeah, subscribe to the channel, like the video, turn on notifications so you know when I upload. And thank you all for watching. I hope you have enjoyed. Big trebuchets are cool. The Warwolf was cool. I find this story funny. Sorry if you're Scottish. Bye-bye.